Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and all creatures great and small. Welcome to another episode of the No Feet Survival Guide. I am your host, Mike Yankura, and again, it's a boy and his microphone going through another episode just for you. And hope you've enjoyed the podcast so far. It's been mostly biographical so far, so hopefully I haven't, one, bored anybody to tears, but two, that I've kept you here so we can move on, because I basically in this first 6 episodes I've caught up with what has happened to me as far as the challenges I've had to overcome. And now I want to take a look more at how I've done it, and hopefully some of those lessons will be passed on to some of you. Hopefully one of you has that little light bulb going off saying, hey, I can try that and see if that works in my life, or do some tinkering with what I tell you. Well, once again, I want to thank everybody who has downloaded the first few episodes so far. I am proud to say I am officially an international podcaster now. I did have one, and yes, only one, download from somewhere other than North America. So whoever downloaded the podcast from South America, whether you did it by accident or what have you, thank you for the download. Hopefully we can get a lot more listeners than what we have now. But thank you for those who have stuck around so far. And once again, for those who are not familiar, you can find me on Spotify, on iHeartRadio. I believe I'm on Pandora now. I'm on Alexa, so if you have the Alexa assistant, you can just tell them, hey Alexa, look up the No Feet Survival Guide, and there I am, booming into your living room. So I'm also on Google Podcasts, so pretty much anywhere you can find a podcast, I'm on there. So I'm finding out just by talking to people when I go out to karaoke on Saturday night that most people have Spotify, or at least the young kids do, at least. So for some of those older folks, I'll still send you the link to the Buzzsprout site, and those are the good folks who are sponsoring this podcast, I guess, for lack of a better word, or who I'm paying to sponsor, as it were. So thank you to those folks. Just look it up on buzzsprout.com, and you will find my podcast on there. Again, I did have a very, very generous donation sent to me by one of my ex-classmates. I want to thank them very much for that. I know they didn't want to have their name mentioned, so I won't mention that name. But again, thank you so much for the donations. So it does cost a little bit of money to keep this going. So, if you do wish to give, I'm on Venmo. You can also find me on Cash App under Michael Yankura. And as always, if there's anybody looking to have me do a plug, hopefully my voice can resonate, as it were. So people do say I have a pretty good radio voice, so hopefully I can do a good spot for you. And also, with me finishing the biographical episodes and getting more into the quote-unquote life lessons that I've learned, I'm also looking to, down the road, have conversations with people who have overcome their own versions of adversity. So if you are someone in that category who has, say, beaten cancer, who has gone through a health crisis, who's gone through a financial crisis, whatever sort of crisis it may be, please email me. The email address is nofeetsg, so NOFEETSG at gmail.com. Let me know, and give me your contact information, obviously, so we can have a conversation. And obviously this will probably be hopefully a couple months down the road, as long as we can keep the podcast going. But I've enjoyed doing this for you folks so far, and to be perfectly honest, though, a lot of this is for myself. It's definitely been a catharsis for me. Ever since I lost my right foot, the second of my amputations, I've had a lot of thought about people saying, "Oh, you're such an inspiration, you keep such a positive vibe out there." And a lot of times, any of the hurt that I have, I certainly try to internalize it as much as I can. And probably not the best thing to do, but in a lot of ways, this has really been helpful to more or less overcome any sort of depression or even self-esteem issues that have kind of hung over me my entire life. And that's part of what we'll get into today. So, it's as much for me as it is for you. And again, if I'm able to reach out to somebody and they learn, they get something out of what I'm saying to you, it's all worthwhile. And whether I have 1 million listeners or if I have 10 listeners, if I can reach one of them, mission accomplished. If I reach more, that's just gravy on top of the mashed potatoes, as it were. So, let's get into what I want to do at this point, because I've gone through my life for the most part, minus a few things here or there, but I want to go over some life lessons that I've learned and some things that I've gathered over the years concerning what we can do as individuals to make our lives a little bit better. And there was a point in time where I was kind of looking into becoming a quote-unquote motivational speaker, or just a general speaker to companies and whatnot. Never dove into it big time or anything like that, but it was something I definitely thought of. And one thing I did do when I talked to the person who was running the program and charging $400 or whatever it was just kind of gather some of my thoughts together on what we could do to make our lives better. And I gathered up 10 things in general to gloss over. And even with that, I've learned a couple other things that I think are important for us to be cognizant of. So, I'm sure this is going to be stuff over the next 6 or 7 or 8 podcasts, or however many it takes, that you've probably heard this 1,000 times. And what's going to make me different than anybody else that you've ever heard as either a motivational speaker, a friend talking to you, a therapist, your priest, your minister, your family, friends, total strangers on the street? What's going to make me different? I have no earthly idea. But again, it's one of those things where I kind of liken it to working in customer service, where you talk to that first person, they're going to tell you something you may not want to hear, and you ask to speak to their supervisor. Now, the supervisor is going to tell you the same thing, but in their own words. And more times than not, that second time, it's going to be like, okay, I get it now, so nothing we could really do here, or what can we do to solve the problem. But sometimes if you don't get it from the first person, or the second person, or the third person, or the 100th person who tells you these things, maybe I'm the one where it clicks in your head. It clicks in your heart. So, again, if it happens to one person, then sitting here in the middle of the night doing a podcast is going to be worth it for me. And what I'd like to go over, and oh boy, hopefully I can get enough time to make sure I fit this in. I'm always worried if it's going to be too long or too short, but the thing I was looking to talk about today was responsibility. And more specifically, self-responsibility for things that you've done or things that have happened to you. And I've been thinking a lot about this over the course of the past year or so, mostly reflecting back on my life, but also just observing how other people treat themselves or how they view themselves. And it's really kind of a fascinating thing, because I would say the vast majority of people are going to not blame themselves for a lot of stuff that happens in their lives, particularly the bad things that happen in their lives, because ultimately you don't want to think of yourself that way. I don't want to think of myself that way. And I think one of the things that being in a Catholic upbringing brings is, you got the Catholic guilt, is ha 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 ha, oh, you've done all these sins and things like that. But you know what, there's a lot of truth to that. And a lot of times when bad things happen to you, you look no further than the mirror. And granted, not everything's going to be your fault, and at the same time, nothing's going to be your fault. It's kind of like the bell curve when you talk about taxes, that there'll be zero income with 0%, zero income with 100% tax, and somewhere in the middle is that height where you're going to be able to collect the most money. And it's kind of the same with a self-responsibility, because more times than not, things are going to come back to decisions you've made. And a lot of times there's going to be bad circumstances that just happen, bad timing, whatever you want to call it. And then there's other times when people just are going to do wrong to you, whether it's through jealousy or through people just wanting to not be kind and good to you or to anyone else for that matter. But I would say a lot of times it comes down to your own self, and do you have the humility to say, hey, this was ultimately my doing, and what can I do to get out of that? And again, reflecting on my life and the things that I've told you, one thing that was kind of overarching, particularly in my early years, probably up until about 5th or 6th grade, I would say, is I just felt like a piece of poo. I mean, there's just no getting around it. Is that I never felt like I was good enough for anything, and I knew I was fairly smart, and I knew, obviously, I've had a sense of humor for the longest time, so may not necessarily reflect in here, but hey, I kind of hold back on that just to be more or less politically correct, I guess, for lack of a better term. But yeah, I knew I had these wonderful traits that were blessed to me from God, but yeah, I just, for whatever reason, there was something in my mind saying, hey, you can't do this, you can't do that, and there's no way I can blame my parents for something like that. I mean, my parents were definitely not abusive in any way, shape, or form, so, and that goes for anybody on either side of my family. This was all internal. This was me not. This was me going overboard on the self responsibility, I suppose. That, yeah, I just didn't feel like I could accomplish anything. And started playing football in 4th grade. And, even there, I was like, okay, yeah, because I'm big, I'm on the line and everything like that. And I felt like, yeah, I might have blocked that guy pretty good, but yeah, what could I have done better for that? And, little did I realize that it was, a lot of that was just me wanting to improve myself, but didn't know how. And I also started getting into amateur wrestling, which I think really helped out with my discipline, with my endurance, even though I wasn't like an overly muscular kid or anything like that, but we were running laps in football, and the one guy who was wrestling, Jim Cumhall, was far and away about a half mile ahead of the rest of us, but there I was, usually in like 2nd or 3rd place because you ran for 20 minutes in wrestling. And I was like, yeah, just the responsibility of doing that and enduring through that helped my psyche a little bit. And then, of all things, while I was wrestling, I got turned on to the world of professional wrestling. And as odd as it may seem, a lot of that helped my self-esteem issues, because when they told their stories through matches and through overarching rivalries, I learned that the good guys, when they lost, they said, hey, I lost, you beat me, but I'm going to come get you. I'm going to beat you, and I'm going to make sure you know it. And somehow it was something like that clicked in my head. And the wrestler I remember the most, and just to kind of back up a tad here, we're talking circa 1981, 1982, when wrestling still had these little fiefdoms or territories, what have you. And being in Cleveland, actually Georgia Championship Wrestling was going into the Ohio territories, because the wrestler who ran Detroit and Cleveland and pretty much all of Ohio and Eastern Indiana had kind of run his business into the ground, so Georgia took over. And with the advent of cable, you had WTBS, so you had Georgia Championship Wrestling. And the one guy I remember was Bullet Bob Armstrong. And he had been, by the 1980s, he had been around for about 15, 20 years or so. And this guy was a man. I mean, there was just no doubt about it. And before I go on, let me make one thing clear. Yes, even then, I knew what pro wrestling was as we know what it is now. But you could tell those guys weren't out there to tickle each other, okay? They were laying some punches in without going full force, and, it actually looked like a competition. And the thing I remember the most was Barb Armstrong had the main Georgia title at that time. He lost the title, and I think it was to Ted DiBiase at the time. And he did an interview where he basically said, "You know what, Ted? That night you got me. I take full responsibility for that loss. But you know what? I'm coming back. I'm going to get that title back from you." And as a 12-year-old kid, that just struck such a chord with me, even knowing what pro wrestling was. It was along the lines of, hey, yeah, that might have been my bad, that you got the better of me that night, but you know what? I'm going to learn from it. And I'm going to come back, and I'm going to beat you, and I'm going to take the title. And now he didn't end up winning the title, but just the fact he picked himself up like that, whether it was in character or not, but that just struck a chord with me. And that's something that I took into high school, into college, and post-college, where, what, people are going to do bad things to you, or people are going to say nasty things. And here I was, this 5'10", 300-pound kid, closing in on 350 and 400 by the time I was getting through college. And, you heard every little snide remark, you heard every little nasty thing that was said about you, snickering behind your back when they think you couldn't hear them. And in the past, I probably would have said, what have I done wrong here? And in that particular case, it was like, you know what? I'm going to try and be responsible enough to, yeah, I admit it's on me a little bit for eating 3 Whoppers at a time, but I'm going to overcome those guys. I'm going to go prove them wrong. And, that's part of being responsible and moving forward in your life, is saying, hey, I don't care who you are. You're going to have some sort of naysayer in your life who's going to say, well, yeah, you're not going to be doing this, and you can't do that. And to them I say, bull cookies. You give it a try. And, bully for you if you prove them wrong, but, if you end up failing, it shouldn't be through a lack of effort. And one of the things I always kind of harken back to as far as responsibility for not only yourself but for others is when my brother and sister-in-law had their first 2 kids. And they're young, and 2 boys just kind of jumping around being boys. And leaping from the couch to the love seat and all this kind of stuff. And, my sister-in-law was obviously feeling responsible for them and scared for their safety. And my brother had a different type of responsibility for it. He was like, yeah, go ahead and try and leap from the couch to the love seat, and it's on me if something happens, but yeah, give it a shot. So, and please forgive me if I feel like I'm jumping all over the place. So, but the one thing I kind of want to emphasize is, yeah, especially once you get older, past a certain age, you've got to take responsibility for decisions you make and things that happen. Obviously, not all of it's going to be your fault, but yeah, that's always the big thing I am trying to emphasize. And again, just to make the point of it, I always knew I had to prove people wrong to those who were snickering behind my back, being the naysayers and things like that. And unfortunately for me, I made decisions, particularly once I got out of college, that I should have made better decisions. That's the bottom line. And I take full responsibility for that, and I sometimes wonder where my life would have been if I had made another choice, or you hit those forks in the road, and what happens if you had gone left instead of going right, and things along those lines. And just to kind of give you an example, when I graduated from college, I had been sports editor for Youngstown State's student paper, the Jambar. And honestly, those were probably two of the most fun years of my life, not only for the fact that I got to talk about sports, write about sports, just being the sports fanatic that I was, and in a certain instance still am, but that's a whole nother ball of wax. But I had an opportunity to go to a couple of little hometown papers. One was in Urbana, Ohio, as opposed to Urbana, Illinois, but Urbana, Ohio, and central western part of Ohio. And then I also had a chance to write for the paper in Columbiana County in Ohio, which was two counties down from, next county down from Youngstown, which was considered the beginning of Appalachia. And for whatever reason, I didn't look at the long-term picture. All I saw was, I'm going to go write for the Lisbon paper in Columbiana County or the Urbana paper. That's probably not my thing. And ended up deciding to pursue another avenue. And again, this was, ultimately I think it was a bad decision. And, here I am some close to 30 years later, and now granted, with the way papers are nowadays, yeah, I probably wouldn't have been writing for a paper. I might have been writing for a blog or a website like The Athletic or something along those lines. But yeah, I think about that bad decision that I made, and I really can't blame anybody else but myself, because in that instance I was looking short term. And I know that's a perfectly natural thing for people to think about. But yeah, I didn't look at the big picture, I didn't look long term, and You know, I could have been writing a book. I could have been doing newspaper things for a long time, and who knows where my life would have been had I made what probably should have been the correct decision. But as it were, I moved on in life, and I think the thing that may have hurt me more than anything was pretty much from age 22 or 23 till probably the age of 40, I was still pretty much a kid. And the jobs that I held at, and I've had numerous jobs, so from that up until the age of 40, and I think back upon that, and there were several bad decisions that I made. I left jobs way too early than I should have, and going back to the theme of responsibility and placing blame, there was an opportunity for me to be a manager of a convenience store. And I ended up quitting before I ever got to that point, even though they had sent me off to manager school for, it was a national chain at the time. I won't mention its name, but its initials are Dairy Mart. And, I scared myself out of that responsibility. And I didn't heed what Barb Armstrong had told me when I was 12 years old through the television. That, whether I failed or succeeded, I needed to try it. And just get myself up and do it, but no, it didn't happen that way, and I made a bad choice there. And then just going through some other things where beginning of 2000 I started working for an outsourced company that represented about 30 different food and beverage companies. And again, I had been there about 6 years. I had done some mistakes that I thought were other people's responsibility, but again, ultimately it was mine. They cut my pay, and that was kind of like the final straw for me. And instead of trying to stick it out and get myself to a possible management position, that's when I looked elsewhere. And again, I think a lot of responsibility has to do with that stick-to-itiveness that a lot of times I sorely lack. That maybe I just have an undiagnosed ADHD that doesn't come out right away, but whatever it is, it's the fact that I wasn't being responsible to myself enough. And again, there were a couple bad circumstances and people who purposely did not want to see me promoted there, so there was a mixed bag, but mostly that's on myself. And again, that's kind of the point of this whole thing, is to say that, people are going to try and do you wrong. You're going to run into bad circumstances, but for the most part, and there could be a combination of all three, which with the company in Brunswick, with integrated marketing, that's what happened to me. It was a combination of all three, but I would say for the most part, it fell on yours truly. And, that was a bad decision. And I just kind of floundered until I took the civil service exam and got hired by Public Utilities of Ohio, the government agency, and moved on to Columbus. And I felt like an adult, finally, at age 40. And, I was responsible for taking care of the bills, for trying to keep myself fairly healthy, which obviously was not good in a couple of circumstances here. But yeah, not only did I feel like an adult, a responsible adult at least, a semi-responsible adult, but there was also a sense of a lot of my self-esteem issues lifting off of me. Now, granted, I still have certain self-esteem issues with relationships to this very day, and some of my self-doubt, and even now, just listening to myself in this podcast. And again, I apologize if I feel like I'm rambling from point to point, but yeah, just thinking about some of these I was like, how could I have made that decision when I should have gone the other side of the fork of the road? And who knows where things might have been there. It certainly would have been different, and whether it was for the better or for the worse, I couldn't tell you. But yeah, I mean, it was important for me to recognize that I've made poor decisions, and I've got to hold myself responsible for that. And for those who have listened to the previous podcast about how I ultimately left the Public Utilities Commission, the comment that I made that was in jest, that's ultimately my responsibility. Even joking at it, I can see where it can definitely be, it was definitely misconstrued. And I don't believe I said what the comment was. I'm going to kind of keep that to myself, or to those the two people who actually heard me say it, and then the rumor and innuendo, as it were, spreading around like wildfire. But ultimately, it came out of my mouth. I had it in my brain, and I thought it was funny, and it still strikes me as a little funny now, but obviously I can see where it's taken seriously, and I've got no one to blame but myself for that. But again, there were other bad circumstances and people just not wanting to give me the benefit of the doubt that led me to those bad decisions, which is kind of one of my points here that I kind of want to get into. Is a lot of times, and let's face it, you may be one of those people. In a certain way, I'm sort of like this, and if you're not one of them, you probably know somebody who is, who just, for whatever reason, has this cloud hanging over their head. And whether you want to call it being unlucky or bad circumstances or what have you, bad things happen to these people. And more times than not, they're they're good people, but just for whatever reason, some of these bad circumstances happen. And one thing I think about that kind of happened to me that I'm still learning to get out of is when bad circumstances happen to you, especially if it's a series of bad circumstances, and you end up making these rash decisions, and it kind of deepens the hole you're trying to dig out of. And I know of a perfect example of someone like that. I mean, I'm kind of like that too, but I have a friend of mine who I had met down here in Columbus while going to a Blue Jackets game. And they happened to be working at the arena at the time, just chit-chatting with them on the bus, and, let's exchange numbers, we'll talk, yada, yada, yada. And I had found out by talking to her of how successful she was coming out of college, how she excelled at her profession. And I kind of not want to get too deep into it because I don't want to further embarrass this person, because I think the world of her. But she ended up traveling internationally, was in books, on TV shows, etc., etc. And for whatever reason, just ran into a set of bad circumstances where the ultimate bad circumstance that ended up happening to her was she was sexually assaulted. And for those who don't believe in PTSD, I've seen it firsthand with this friend, and it saddens me to no end. But having said that, and again, I'm not sure if this is stemming from the PTSD or the way they were raised or just their general mentality. But because of those bad circumstances, there's been a lot of rash decisions made. And she feels like she can't get out of the hole unless everybody assists her in getting her out without her making an effort or making a slow motion effort, if that makes any sense. In other words, she knows what she needs to do to better herself, to get her out of the living situation she's in now. And, again, whether it's through the PTSD or what have you, it's been a long process for her. And, I've known her for close to 3 years now, I think. And in all that time, her sexual assault happened a couple years before she had met me. And, things just kind of spiraled downward. And even with those bad decisions that she makes, she blames it on everybody else. I haven't done anything wrong. I try to be nice to these people. These people are being mean to me. Well, I'm not there, so I can't tell you what exactly happened. But, every time she feels like another bad circumstance happens to her, which, yeah, sometimes it's people doing it wrong, but it's also not taking responsibility for yourself and not letting them live rent free in your head. And it just kind of keeps setting her back. And, I wish I knew a solution for that for her. But it's ultimately going to be up to her. And for anybody who's been a victim of a crime, especially something like that, and your life feels out of control. Again, I wish I had an answer for you as to how to get out of that. And now I've known people who have gotten out of that, and they've not only survived, they're thriving. And God bless them for it. But again, it's one of those things where, yeah, this bad thing happened to me, but I've got to take responsibility for myself to pick myself up and move forward and, screw all the naysayers. So, yeah, she's definitely one of those people who doesn't think they're doing anything wrong, but, in the long run, they're making some bad decisions that stem from the bad circumstances. And I could tell you of another friend of mine who kind of does that, who, blames everybody else. It's President Trump's fault. It's old white men. It's this, it's that, it's the other thing, but yeah, ultimately you got to get yourself out of that circumstance. And that's something I still need to do myself, and doing something like this kind of gets the motivation going in me to possibly be a motivational speaker and say, hey, I'm going to get myself out of this. You can too. Now, on the other side of the coin, though, and I have a friend who's kind of going through this, and it's a lot like what I had gone through in my early years and through huge patches of my life, where they think they're responsible for all their bad things that have happened to them. And that's simply not true. It's not true for anybody that I'm aware of. Obviously it's going to be somewhere in the middle where, yeah, probably the majority of bad things that happen to you are stem from bad decisions, but there's bad things that happen to you by unlucky circumstances and people who want to do you wrong. And this other friend of mine is, God bless them, because they are trying to atone for their sins of the past. And they feel so responsible that, every little thing that's happened to them is their fault. And, unfortunately, there's people in that person's life who, whether knowingly or not, kind of did wrong by her. And my friend would seem to think, yeah, what did I do wrong to have them wrong me? And again, that's simply not the case. I mean, she's looking, she's so worried that she is not going to be forgiven by God for her transgressions that she did herself, that other people had done to her, that think that where she thinks it's her fault. You know, just the fact that you're remorseful for that sin, that you're truly sorry, God's going to forgive you for that. But at the same token, I hope God tells my friend to not beat yourself up. And this person has told me that several times when I've given my stories of woe. That, you know, sometimes you're just unlucky, and sometimes people just don't see the beautiful people that we all are inside. You know, and sometimes it doesn't come out in some people, you know, don't get me wrong here. But, you know, people were meant to be good, and some people, for whatever reason, can't stand that. And I think the worst part is those people who do wrong to other people, and in particular my friend, have it worked up to where they think it's their fault. And, you know, sometimes it's just not. And I guess the point I'm trying to make with all this is, you know, in terms of responsibility for your life, yeah, a lot of it's gonna fall on you. But you know what? There's only one person I know in history who didn't make a mistake. And he got hung up on a cross for people wanting to do him wrong. Outside of that guy, we make mistakes. We're going to make bad decisions. And I think one of the keys to responsibility is when you do make a mistake on your own, are you going to own up to it? And, you know, in my case, the bad decisions I've made, some of them, the second or about 5 seconds after I did it, I was like, why did I just do that? And then there's other times where it's taken me 10 years to go, yeah, you know what? I messed up. And I probably should have done A, B, or C instead. Any one of those would have been better than letter D, which I did. And part of the responsibility is, too, that sometimes there's bad timing in it, and that's not necessarily your fault. And there's times when people, for whatever reason, just want to do wrong to you. And that's not your fault either. That's on them. And I think one of the keys to life is recognizing which one is which. And sometimes there's a combination of the things, but one of them's going to stand out above the other one or the other two. So I think recognizing our responsibility, being humble enough to say, hey, I messed up, or to be brave enough to say, you know, whatever that person did, they weren't trying to help me out here, and I need to leap over that hurdle. And that kind of brings me to the biggest part of responsibility is once something bad has happened to you, no matter how it happened, what are you going to do to pick yourself up and move yourself forward? And hopefully just the fact that I try to keep a positive outlook on life, that God has blessed me with a sense of humor where, well, and I got a gift a couple weeks ago from a friend of mine whose niece made a customized coffee mug that says, "Fluent in movie quotes and sarcasm." And if that doesn't fit me to a T personally, I don't know what does. But, it's things like that where I could recall a song or recall a movie to kind of reference to the situation to make a point, but also to say, hey, the bad thing that happened to me, I'm gonna overcome it. Whether, and again, I refer back to Bullet Bob Armstrong saying, hey, you beat me, you got me, I'm gonna get you next time. And I think about that quite a bit. And I'll probably do a whole podcast on how professional wrestling can help you in life. At least the old school wrestling. Some of this new school stuff, But anyway, the thing with responsibility is, do you recognize what it was? Was it on you? Was it on somebody else? Was it just bad timing, bad luck, bad circumstances? And what are you going to do to beat that bad decision? And obviously, people have had worse things done than what's happened to me. And a lot of them overcome it, and some are still trying to get over that hurdle. But, unfortunately, they aren't recognizing what's happening with them in terms of making decisions or in terms of overcoming the original obstacle. And my final thought on that will be, as adults listening to this podcast, one, I hope you make a lot more good decisions than bad decisions. But when you make those bad decisions, that one, you own up to it. Two, you know how to overcome it. And even in overcoming bad things that happen to you, whether it's through the situation or people doing you wrong, how are you going to overcome that? And that's always an individual decision. And hopefully, if someone does do you wrong or you run into a bad situation, that you recognize it for what it is, and that you figure out a way to beat it. So again, I want to thank everybody for listening to this. Hopefully, I felt like I rambled, even though I've got a lot of notes here. It kind of go off tangent. Again, I probably have an undiagnosed ADHD for all I know. But I want to thank you for listening. And again, the email address is nofeetsg@gmail.com. That's nofeetsg@gmail.com. I can be heard on Spotify, iHeartRadio, Alexa, Google Podcasts, Pandora, pretty much anywhere you can download a podcast. I should be on there. And again, if you do want to help fund the show, it does cost a little bit of money for a boy in his microphone to relay this all to you, but You can donate through Venmo or through Cash App. Again, thank you so much to my classmate who donated so generously to the show. I can't thank them enough. If you're running a company or if you want to have some sort of sponsorship deal, please email me. I'd be more than happy to look at the product and plug it for you. And also for anyone who has overcome their adversities, whether on their own or from other people or the situations, and you've shown the responsibility enough to overcome it, to move forward, to vault ahead of it, please email me. And I'd love to have a chat with you over a future podcast. So, thank you again for listening. I hope everybody has a great week out there. May God bless you. May God bless your friends and family. And no matter what decisions you may make, good or bad, you are still great to me. So, and I thank you again. And God bless you. Take care. See you next week.